Hello and welcome to CIA Recording, and I am Agent Amor in Dublin.
And I'm Agent 17 in New York.
And we look at relationships in astrology, and we're starting a new series where we're going to be looking at the role of the planets in relationships. So we're going to start with Venus, Aphrodite, romantic Venus. So what initial thoughts do you have, Armand, about Venus?
Well, Venus is a planet that has a lot of energy in astrology because it, first of all, rules two signs. And that is, to me, that is like quite significant. And I think that Venus in Taurus and Venus in Libra are very different. It is, when I look at a chart, it is the planet that really signifies what the person thinks about relationship. And then by extension, what they think about or what they maybe look for in a partner. But that's an extension of what the person thinks about relationship. And of course, also to how they relate. So it is really quite an important planet.
It is, isn't it? I mean, both Venus and Mars are considered the most important planets in relationships. And it's really interesting looking a little bit at the mythology that, of course, Venus came, all that beautiful image of Venus coming out of the water is really that Saturn castrated Uranus, and out of his genitals came Venus. So out of something pretty horrific comes this absolutely beautiful goddess, Aphrodite. And, there's something about that image where she's very independent. So Venus is that part of us that is also, I think, which really the crucial bit is about how we value ourselves. What is our sense of self-worth? And from that place of kind of being focused on our own self-worth, then also comes what we value in other people. Because, of course, if we don't know what we value ourselves or what we find beautiful or attractive, it's very hard to know what we'll be drawn to, even what kind of works of art we might be drawn to. So that's really the crux, and she's certainly a very feisty, independent goddess.
Very much so. And, as the planet of relationship, Venus is not necessarily, I wouldn't say that depending upon sign placement, it cannot be, but Venus is not necessarily the most emotional planet. It's really about relationship. It's not the moon and how you feel about things, and the sun of how what you are. It's about relating and relationship. It's in some ways, and certainly in some times, it can be a very conceptual planet.
So true, particularly as ruler of Libra, where there's that kind of very much about that interaction, but it's not necessarily an emotional interaction. And I think as ruler of Taurus, there's a little bit more of that sensuality of enjoyment, but it's also connected to self-enjoyment. And I remember many years ago, Liz Green talking about Aphrodite as a very vain goddess. She's very adored, and it's true because it's very much about her loving herself, which is part of that Taurian self-love and self-value, rather than necessarily connecting with somebody else. So I think that's also very interesting. So it's back to kind of that sense of self-image.
Well, entirely so, because Venus, wherever your Venus, if you have Venus in Gemini, if that's the case, that's where your Venus is. That's where, and then that's what you think about relationship, what you think about the partner, but it's you. It's not the other, it's you. And then it's the way that we open up and relate to the other. But it really does start off itself.
Yes, and back to her being very independent, absolutely. That she was married to Hephaesto, and she wasn't really attracted to him, but she was married, and somehow she stays married to him in mythology. And yet her lover was Ares, of course, who was Mars, and that was where it seemed to be the passion was. But she still remained quite independent. So I think it reminds us about the importance in relationships to retain our sense of self, to really keep hold of that part of us that really values ourselves above anything else, and not getting lost in relationship. That relationship it can be a part of our life, and of course we relate with other people all the time, but even with our significant other, not to lose that sense of self, because we lose that Venus, really.
It is more than possible to place too much emphasis on relationship, too much emphasis on the other person, and that becomes a real problem. And yes, Venus, Aphrodite as a somewhat I don't know if selfish is the right word, but sort of self-interested goddess makes a lot of sense to keep in mind. So what about the difference between Venus and Taurus, Venus as ruler of Taurus, Venus as ruler of Libra?
Well, I think there's a part when she's the ruler of Taurus, there's much more, as I said, that sensual side, but also it's a little bit more primal. It's a little bit more in the body, physical, connected with that human dimension of ourselves. In Libra, there's more of that, it's a mental energy. It's more of that very civilized interaction of how can I connect with the other and how can we be equal. So it's very much more, it feels more on that mental level. I mean, what do you think about it? How would you describe it?
I agree. Venus and Libra are very gracious. Graciousness is a word that I would use, but also mannered. And manners are rules. Manners are rules, and Venus and Libra enforces the rules. Libra, the scales, and if we think about justice, we have a goddess, very much like Venus, holding the scales of justice in one hand and a sword in the other. Kind of, and this is kind of like when you don't mind your manners, when you're called out on something, you feel that. So I think that there is almost a severe side to Venus and Libra. Venus and Taurus, I think you're right. It's very sensual, very much about enjoyment, very much about what feels good, and it's the appreciation of the physical, a different side of the goddess.
I think also the other side is that she's equal. Aphrodite is equal to the other gods. She's not considered because she's female that she's unequal. And so I think it reminds us of that need for equality in relationships, whether it's male-female, whether it's female-female, regardless of the relationship, but that there needs to be both a respect for the other and, a basic recognition of equality. And I think, again, that Libra scale really reminds us. And of course, about the concept of beauty, because both Taurus and Libra are concerned with beauty, both natural beauty in Taurus and more kind of artistic, civilized beauty with Libra. And really, that's also what Venus is, that we need to find our loved one beautiful. That's such an important thing, that part of being drawn to somebody is finding somebody attractive according to what we find attractive. It's not according to anybody else's measures of attractiveness, but that's also part of Venus. What do I find beautiful? That's an important thing that our Venus helps us to answer. So, sorry, I was going to say, maybe we can look at it, maybe at Venus through the signs. What does she find attractive and what does she find beautiful?
Well, let's start out with Venus in Aries, since Aries is the first sign, and Aries like to go first anyway.
Be careful. Yes.
And Venus in Aries, of course, we've talked about this at other times. Venus in Aries sometimes is recognized as being, or is thought of as being in some detriment, that it is not a good placement for Venus. I think that's bunk, and I believe that you do too.
Yes, nothing personal there. Yes.
But it's Venus in Aries, very outgoing, adventurous. I feel likes to be, likes to have something to do, likes to begin things, likes to start things up. But maybe I'm not the expert on Venus in Aries.
Okay, since it's my Venus, I'll own her. I think really Venus in Aries likes to play, likes adventure, likes fun, likes excitement, and likes the pursuit of a relationship. So Venus in Aries usually loves the initial part of kind of, does that person like me? Do I like, blah, 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 all that kind of dating stage, really. And so needs to keep that within a relationship, needs to keep an element of fun, excitement, playfulness within a relationship. I think certainly is very important for Venus in Aries, and also values that in somebody else, values somebody who's a good sense of humor, who has a sense of fun, who likes to go on adventures, and certainly is probably unlikely to be very drawn to somebody who is very set in their ways and very conservative.
Indeed. Venus in Taurus, we've talked about it a little bit in the sort of theoretical Venus as ruler of Taurus, but I think that, if someone that has Venus in Taurus, I feel that there's a need to be able to appreciate the relationship in the present moment. Whatever you're doing, from it's Taurus, so a good meal, sex, a walk on the beach, whatever it is, there needs to be that ability to appreciate it in the moment. This is not a very conceptual Venus. This is an experiential Venus.
So true, very much in the body, and I think also very much appreciative of the beauty in nature. And I think Venus in Taurus really needs to have some beauty in its surroundings. It doesn't do well in an environment that isn't beautiful, particularly beautiful in terms of the natural environment around it. So may not do very well stuck surrounded by concrete. And of course, we're generalizing here. We're not looking at aspects. We're not looking at houses. Although certainly I often look at the signs as related to the houses. I know not all astrologers do, but so I think I think listeners could relate whether they have Venus in Aries in the first house. There are some similarities, not the same, and similarly with Venus in Taurus in the second house.
I agree. And the other thing I feel with Venus in Taurus, Venus in the second house, there is the upside of Taurus is the appreciation and the sensuality. I think that one of the sand traps that you can get caught in with Venus and Taurus is a little bit too much emphasis on the material.
Yes, that's so true. And I think that part of that is that Taurus, generally the sign of Taurus, likes the material because it gives access to choices and to beauty, to having a comfortable environment. And I think Venus in Taurus in particular can get caught up in, money and wanting money, again, because it gives access to comfort, to security. And those are so key to the sign of Taurus. Whereas, of course, Venus in Aries doesn't really care about those things, as long as there's some excitement.
Venus in Gemini.
That's an interesting one, really, isn't it? Because here we're totally in the mental sphere. And, my understanding of Venus in Gemini is that it really enjoys intellectual connection. So somebody where you can have a great conversation with, where you can share ideas, where there's really width and space around it. So the constriction that Venus in Gemini doesn't do well with is actually any kind of mental constriction. And like anything in an air sign, it needs room to breathe. So again, not to be crowded in and not to be surrounded by people whose attitudes are very narrow. I mean, what do you think, Armand, about Venus in Gemini?
I agree. I think that Venus in Gemini likes to have a bit of flexibility. Gemini being a mutable sign, does not like a lot of constraints in relationship. It's fine. We're relating. There's me and there's you, but there's me and there's you. There's the recognition of the duality there. It's very strong. Venus in Gemini in general, like when it transits through the sign every year, and to an extent for people with that natally, can also enjoy a little bit like Venus in Aries, a little bit of the flirtiness, the connecting, light sociability is something that, maybe among a group of friends, spending time and so on, and maybe having someone special come out of that is, I think, very typical for Venus in Gemini.
So true. And I think that's true, that it's very important that Venus in Gemini does do well with a relationship developing from a friendship and needs to always maintain that friendship aspect in a relationship. So Venus in Cancer, of course, then it's a whole different thing. We're into really much more the emotional realm, and we're somewhere where really there needs to be a degree of comfort, is attracted to something or someone who feels familiar, that there's a degree of being able to relate emotionally. A little bit of a similarity to Venus in Taurus, in that Venus in Cancer really also likes a nice environment, nice food, safety, security, familiarity, but except that it's much more on an emotional level. So it really requires a degree of empathy. So of course it's the sign of the moon, Cancer, so there are a lot of similarities with lunar needs.
I think that moon and Cancer, Venus and Cancer also has.
They're similar, yes.
Yeah. Cancer is the sign of our origins, what we come out of, our family, the environment that we come out of. And I actually think that Venus in Cancer is one of the more conceptual Venuses, although it's an emotional image rather than a mental image. But I think that there is sometimes a sense of the tradition in which one grows up in, having a sense that and whatever it is, for your culture, for your neighborhood, for your family, for wherever you pick up the idea, the sense of like, well, this is what relationship is. This is, we all know that this is what relationship is, and so it can be kind of traditional, a kind of traditional image of relationship. Although, it's not to say that it's any one particular tradition. It's just whatever you feel is tradition.
Yes, that's a really great way to describe it. Thank you. Yes, that's an interesting way to look at it. And then we come, of course, to Venus and Leo, a whole different energy. And we're back to Venus in a fire sign, which has a lot, of course, all the three fire signs have a lot in common. And Venus in Leo is a little bit different to Venus in Aries in that it's a little bit more that it kind of enjoys maybe the kind of almost the drama of getting together. So it's not so much necessarily the chase, but the fact that this is like creating a story, a drama, of which, of course, the Venus in Leo would rather be the centerpiece. Now, Venus, or the center person, Venus in Leo can be immensely generous, like any planet in Leo. So it really, really needs to be heart focused. So Venus in Leo does very well if it's attracted to somebody, or if it kind of, there's a mutual attraction with somebody where there's a heart connection. And I think that's a very important piece for the Venus in Leo that sometimes gets ignored because it's seen more as the kind of, enjoying the drama of it all. But actually underneath it, there's a real need to have that heart connection. And I think then the Venus can really show its extreme generosity, I would say. What do you think?
I agree. With all of these, I was going to say two, but then I had to sort of, there's many different perspectives, there's many different ways it comes out. And the central idea is the heart. But then, of course, you can take things at different levels. And if the heart isn't getting what it needs, then it becomes drama and melodrama.
Yes.
But I do think that Venus in Leo likes to be shown. If you love me, show me.
Yes.
And a grand gesture, it may only be a grand gesture, but let's see it. Let's see it. Let's get a look at it.
Well, I think all the Venuses in fires like grand gestures. They like doing grand gestures, and they like having grand gestures. I think that's the nature of fire. Yeah, so Venus in Virgo, would you like to start us off, Armand, with Venus in Virgo?
The fall of Venus. Well, first of all, people will tell you that Venus in Virgo is very picky. And, sometimes a little bit, I guess. It's not entirely unreasonable to say, wow, perfect. Oh, no, but I think that if there's an issue with Venus in Virgo, it's that, Venus is Libra, the scales of balance, and Virgo is the sign of service. And there's the tendency to put oneself below the partner, or the person that you're attracted to, and to think, no matter who they are, so out of my league type of thing. And that's something that, Venus in Virgo, I think, has to work through. Venus in Virgo tends to show affection a great deal by being helpful, by being of service, and likes, it would be nice to get a little bit of help once in a while. So, Venus in Leo is looking for like that, where's the big card and everything. Venus in Virgo is like, but I made you soup when you didn't feel well, it's that type of thing. But I really, Venus and Virgo gets along just fine. Don't worry.
I'm glad to hear it. And I think you would know a lot more about it than I would, Armand. So, and one thing I'd like to add to it, although it's not my Venus, but, my experience of Venus in Virgo is that there is a great humility, unlike the Venus in Leo, which is rather more, notice me, I'm here. There's much more of a stand back quality, a more humble quality about Venus in Virgo. And to be careful not to be very self-critical, I think, because there is that Virgo quality of kind of never quite been enough. So maybe Venus in Virgo can learn a little bit from Venus in Leo in valuing itself really to its, and being very discerning as well about, and maybe there is a quality of Venus in Virgo about being discerning of who it will get involved with, who it will mix with, and not in a way judging another, more in a way of will this work or not, because there's no point wasting time.
I think that there's certainly an element of discernment there. I think that there is a little bit of caution that is just part of Virgo. I think it could probably be a challenge to sort of let down the walls. Virgo is good if it's not. Virgo is not about putting up walls, but that can sometimes be the default Virgo strategy if there's a sense of vulnerability. Virgo really needs to learn to be self-contained, and then it doesn't have to worry about anything. But I think Venus and Virgo can be very giving, and as I said, it's a fine sign for Venus.
Absolutely. I think Venus in Aries and Venus in Virgo are the best. I think we can agree to that.
No wonder we're doing relationship astrology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Venus in Libra. So here we're in, of course, one of her own signs, and here we're in the sign of the weighing scales, the balance, the justice, that side of her which wants equality. And I think really Venus in Libra, one of the things that she's constantly assessing is really me and the other person. So there's that constant trying to balance of how much does she want and how much she compromises, and always taking into account the other person, which sometimes can be a little challenging, in fact, for Venus, because ultimately if it's about what do I want, what do I value, what do I find beautiful, it's how can she maintain the I part in the we part, really, I think is a little challenging.
I also feel that Venus in Libra is perhaps it's a very, and this is an air sign, so it is like literally a conceptual sign where the image of what a relationship is, and this time, unlike Cancer, it doesn't necessarily come from tradition and early environment. It can come from just about anything that you latch onto and say, this is the ideal relationship. And it can be hard to, well, it's impossible, I'll just come right out and say it, to live up to ideals in that way for most of us. And I think that Venus in Libra, sometimes the challenge is to appreciate what you have as opposed to looking at it in terms of the ideal. And I think that Venus and Libra can be very idealistic in relationships.
That's a very good point. And also, I think all of the Venus and air signs struggle with the messiness of relationships. And the reality is that relationships are messy. They're messy emotionally, they're messy physically, they're messy mentally, they're messy on every level. And I think that Venus in Libra, exactly as you say, there's that idealism, and all the Venuses in air, they love the concept of relationship, but actually the messiness of getting involved in a relationship and being in a relationship can sometimes be a little challenging.
I'm not so sure Venus and Virgo really likes that.
That's true. Yes.
Venus and Scorpio. Now, this is another one that traditionally has a bad rap. And what do you think?
I think it's extremely passionate. I mean, Venus in Scorpio, I think it can protect itself. Sometimes it doesn't like being vulnerable, no more than Venus in Virgo does, or Venus in Cancer. And I think Venus in Scorpio, the difference is that sometimes Venus in Scorpio, to protect itself, may not just put up a wall, but may actually have a little sting in its tail if it feels a little hurt. I think Venus in Scorpio needs to feel sexy. It needs to be with somebody in a relationship where that is admired and recognized, and also is likely to be attracted to somebody where there is an attraction based on sexual component as well. And by that I mean, sometimes when I'm saying that, people say to me, isn't that necessary for everyone? But, for some people, really, the attraction could be a mental attraction. And there are some couples who are very happy having a very intellectual connection. But Venus in Scorpio, that would not be enough. I mean, of course, it needs that as well. But it also needs a very strong chemistry, I guess, in layman's term, just chemistry, attraction, pull, dynamic that really goes under the surface and is very intense. So it needs passion and intensity.
I always think about Scorpio with Venus particularly as needing that sort of beyond chemistry, almost is down to the sort of nuclear bond. The thing that holds the atom together. Really looking for that deep core connection, and I think of sexuality as being a way to get to that core connection, which is. Some of the signs, there's other approaches, maybe, sexuality comes out of a sense of deep connection. I think one of the things with Scorpio is that it can be a way into that connection. But Venus and Scorpio, there are potentials for some of the things like power plays and jealousy and all that there is, because there is such a depth, and with depth comes vulnerability. So, yeah.
I totally agree. And I think, again, besides kind of, little sting in the tail, I think if Scorpio feels very vulnerable, it could be regardless of anything in the relationship, but it could be outside, then Venus in Scorpio can also pull back sexually because it feels so vulnerable. So it's got to trust, and trust is not an easy thing for anything in Scorpio.
No, yeah. Exactly. It's a water sign. It's a feeling sign. It's very intuitive, and I think scorpions or arachnids, and people talk about, since Spider-Man, about their spidey senses and so on. And I think what happens is that sometimes even a minor type of vibration, can set off a whole thing of doubt. And you have to be it requires a lot of consciousness to be aware of, what is really there, what's real, genuine cause for concern, and what is a little minor vibration of a passing thought or something like that doesn't really require that. That's a sort of a challenge for Venus and Scorpio.
Totally, absolutely. And then we've got Venus in Sagittarius, whole different energy, of course. Here we have a Venus that's an adventurer, that loves to travel, of course. That's, a lot of Venus in Sagittarius really enjoys meeting, being attracted to people in different situations, from other countries, from other cultures, learning. There has to be that learning component, I think, for Venus and Sag. And so it really loves people who are different ages, different, all kinds of differences are fascinating and interesting. And very like Venus in the other 5 signs, it needs adventure. So it needs excitement. It needs, I think any Venus in fire, there always has to be almost a light at the end of the tunnel, that there's going to be something exciting or something fun that's going to happen. If that light goes out in a relationship because there's too many mundane things impinging on it, then that can be really flattening for particularly a Venus in Sagittarius. So it needs to kind of have a partner or a relationship where there's really somebody who is like a co-adventurer, that they can go off and slay some dragons together.
I think there has to be that sense of exploration, and perhaps a little bit of a cause. Slaying dragons is a cause. That brings people together. I think that the need for adventure is strong in Sagittarius, and in a relationship that kind of like sort of holds you down, then you might start thinking, looking elsewhere. It could happen because Sagittarius is always looking for the next thing. So you're either doing that together or you're going to do that separately. It's important to remember that things can work on many different levels, and so to have a shared interest and to have a shared focus of things to explore, even if, or else just pack up and go on holiday to an island or something like that is a nice thing too.
Yes, and also freedom is very important for all the Venuses in fire. Freedom is a hugely important thing. And I think that's why Venus in fire for many generations was quite challenging for women in particular cultures, because if women were expected to be the passive kind of, have an apron tied around their waist, baking cookies in the kitchen, really that does not suit Venus in fire. So because it's fiercely independent and really enjoys also that independence is recognized. It doesn't mean that Venus and fire women don't want the support, but it's about being equal. So that's pretty crucial, particularly for Venus and Sagittarius.
Yes, particularly for Venus and Sagittarius. Although I agree, the fire signs have that. Venus in Capricorn. This is a sign that is associated with a certain amount of stability and structure. And I think Venus in Capricorn likes there to be structure in a relationship, whatever that is. And there's a great deal of variability, but I think that Venus in Capricorn likes there to be some degree of structure, likes to have a partner who is solid. Capricorn, so rock, Saturn, lead.
Yes. It's rooted, isn't it? It likes boundaries, it likes containment, it likes to be clear. It also likes to know what the rules are. So it wants to be very clear, who is this other person? And it can be quite slow. My experience of Venus in Capricorn in watching people is really that they do better sometimes step by step in a relationship. So it's not a Venus that wants to rush in. It's a Venus that tends to do better if it puts the foundations in, maybe gets to know somebody slowly over a period of time, and then builds something that is very solid with them, rather than the big romance or needing that whoosh, of coming together like some of the other signs do. And it can do incredibly well. I've seen, Venus in Capricorn create amazingly stable, solid, loving relationships that were built on a really strong foundation. But Venus in Capricorn doesn't really have much time for being messed around or being lied to or betrayal or not that any of the Venus is like that, but it particularly really doesn't do well with that. It needs to respect the other person, and it needs huge mutual respect.
I also think that Venus in Capricorn does not have very much what you said about the slowness and that slow, steady building relationship. That Venus in Capricorn does not have the compulsion for relationship that a lot of other signs do. And, of course, everybody's chart, nothing is equal. I didn't say all things are equal. Nothing is equal. But Venus in Capricorn itself does not have the compulsion for relationship. I've got to be in one. Usually, okay, when the right one comes along and we'll get there type of thing. It's not like, I got to have it right now. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, yeah, it's much more self-sufficient. It has that ability to be self-sufficient. One of the things, though, to mention in my experience of Venus in Capricorn is that it can have an incredible sense of humor. So it's very good at laughing at itself. So it really enjoys that sense of fun. Although it appears to be so serious, it actually does like and is attracted to companionship where there is laughter in it as well, so that there is that fun.
Indeed. I just want to mention that with Capricorn, as with Libra and Cancer and Aries, the cardinal signs, a lot of what we're saying about it, and it just sort of rings the bell so much with Capricorn, with both Pluto going through Capricorn and Aries, Uranus going through Aries to square it over the course of the last few and next few years, a lot of these Venuses in those cardinal signs have been and are getting shaken up. And so, Venus in Capricorn recently, if Uranus is landing on that Venus, there may be a great change from some of these things, and Libra may be getting, some of the images may be getting broken up. So just to point out that we're speaking in a kind of decontextualized sort of way within the context of what's going on. Things could be very different.
True, and also that the whole model of relationship is changing, so all of these characteristics are also going to go through changes. I totally agree.
Yes, all of this stuff. We try to stay away from stereotypes so much, but you have to use words, and words you're describing a changing flow of things. It's like talking about this wave of the river or something like that. Aquarius.
Gosh, well, Aquarius, we're back to air signs. And Aquarius, of course, is the most, in a way, the most removed of the air signs, because it really has that need to stand back and get an overview. And Venus in Aquarius, a little bit like Libra, is so idealistic. But unlike Libra, which is more about one-to-one relationships, Venus in Aquarius is so concerned with relationships with the whole collective. So I think where Venus in Aquarius maybe struggles a little bit is on that one-to-one level. And it can really connect with the tribe, with the collective, with groups. But when it comes in a one-to-one, it sometimes again, struggles with the messiness of one-to-one relationships, with the emotional aspect of one-to-one relationships, because it's so idealistic. And it's like, why can't we all just love each other in this intellectually perfect way? And it's trying to maneuver around that. So it's an Aphrodite who is really a kind of more kind of wanting to, evolve society and work for the evolution of relationships rather than necessarily get messed up and tangled up in a personal relationship.
And Margaret, I think that when we take that sort of evolutionary collective view, and then people have to have their individual relationships, I think that it is, again, one of the most idealistic signs for Venus. And that ideal can, in fact, be, it's Aquarius, so it may be very, very different from tradition, and very different from Libra or Cancerian ideas of tradition, not traditional at all. And yet, although it's unconventional and perhaps unique, it's a fixed sign, and there can be a kind of, this is the way things should be. It may be a form of relationship or an image of the partner that nobody has ever seen before, and yet there is a kind of, but it's got to be what I think it should be, and there can be a little bit of rigidity that way. Again, that can lead to difficulty appreciating the relationship you have as opposed to the relationship that you can conceive of.
And back to the freedom issue, I think very similarly to the fire signs, this is a Venus who wants to be, very free and independent, and really needs a lot of space to breathe. So, and this is something, I want to make sure, of course, we covered the last Venus, but also to say that in understanding relationships, when we understand the Venus of our partner or significant other, it really helps us to understand that so much of how they're relating to us is not personal to us. It's really from their planet, and what they value and what they need in order to meet those needs is really about where these planets are. So that's where it's so useful to look at astrology and understanding relationships.
Yeah, certainly so.
But we cannot leave Venus in Pisces out, even though Pisces has that self-sacrificial tone. I think she would be very distressed if Aphrodite in the sign of Pisces got left out. So what are your initial thoughts about Venus and the final sign of the zodiac?
Venus in Pisces, if Aquarius is about the collective on an intellectual, conceptual level, Venus in Pisces is about the collective, however without any boundaries in its definition. It's a cosmic level Venus. I feel that it is in its sort of pure state, it is really more agape. It is that kind of universal love and compassion rather than eros, rather than that sort of driven, or even like or just very simply just say the very personal sense of love. Although, of course, as with Aquarius or any of the more collective signs, the people that have Venus in Pisces are going to want to have personal relationships. It's not like everybody is heading up for the monastery or up to the cave to meditate and develop an impersonal sense of universal love. I think that Venus in Pisces does have to be careful about being a little too self-sacrificing in a way that is not entirely different from Venus in Virgo. But I think that Venus in Pisces also has the ability, it dissolves boundaries. And I think that there's the ability to really appreciate and love a wide variety of people. I don't feel that it has much of the exclusiveness that a lot of the other signs have. I don't feel that it's limited by concepts. That requires, though, for the person who is so open to different types of relationship, a certain amount of caution has to come from someplace in the chart to prevent, just keep opening up and giving, because then you get into that self-sacrificing thing.
So true. And I think the thing to counteract that is very important is a sense of self, so that there's a very strong sense of self that doesn't get lost. Because I think one of the things with Venus in Pisces can be the avoidance of relationships because there's such a fear of losing oneself. And if there's an experience of handing over, then sometimes there's that, Piscean escapism, maybe through substances rather than relationships or through work or whatever, an avoidance of actually having that intimacy, and also avoidance because it avoids commitment, which Pisces doesn't like. So I think the Venus in Pisces, the more the Venus in Pisces person develops a strong sun, a strong sense of self, good Saturn boundaries, all of those good solid things, then the easier it is to really love unconditionally, which is what the Venus in Pisces, I think, really wants to do, and to also be connected and allow that to happen without being fearful of drowning in those watery realms, because it's so emotional. And so Venus in Pisces, the connection has to be an emotional connection, but without a strong sense of self, that kind of soul, emotional, spiritual connection can also feel overwhelming.
And just to mention that one of the ways that that can manifest is because Pisces has a tendency to idealize, in that sense of, like, you know, casting a glow around the partner, you know,
Yes.
or relationship itself. You know, when I'm in a relationship, I'll be happy. You know, when, you know, that's what's lacking.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
when I have that. Or of course, then of course, there's the Piscean helplessness of, like, I'll never have a relationship, I'll never have a partner, and for the, you know, so some of the, you know, Pisces just takes a lot of those emotions, potentially can bring them out to extremes, and to just, you know, it's good to be able to sort of step back a little bit and say, okay, well, you know, things aren't going great now, or things are going great now, but this isn't necessarily, you know, the totality of life.
I so agree. And just to say that probably next time our next recording will be on Mars, who of course is very connected to Venus and one of the very important planets of relationship. And we hope you will all join us in the membership section of CIA for our next edition.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks a lot, Armand. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, Margaret.